Hello, Romantics. I'm Sarah Gomez, author, romance lover, and host. You're listening to Romancing the Story, a podcast centered around writing, reading, and story structure, all with a twist of romance. We're at episode 27, and on today's episode, I speak with award-winning author and storyteller Kate Forsyth. We chatted about her newest story that weaves a compelling tale from the myth of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. The story also seeks to give power back to women. Plus, we touch on her writing process, differences in myths versus fairy tales, and how authors can restructure retellings for current times. If you're interested in seeing the video version of the interview, the link will be in the show notes. With that said, let's get right to the interview. Welcome internationally best-selling author and master storyteller, Kate Forsyth. Yay!
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much for joining the podcast. And I know I had the incredible opportunity to hear you speak several years ago when you came over to the States. In case listeners don't know, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Absolutely. So I'm an Australian author, so I don't get to the US very often. I've wanted to be a writer ever since I can remember, ever since I was a very little girl. And I'm now lucky enough to make my living by my writing. I generally write historical fiction. I have a doctorate in fairy tale studies, so I like to draw on myth and folklore in my tales, spin them in unexpected and surprising ways. I'm particularly drawn to telling the stories of forgotten women, women whose voices have been silenced. And so many of my books have this kind of, feminist feeling about them where I'm giving back women their voices.
What a lovely thing, a lovely way to kind of, bring about when you're writing, right? To give these voices to people who, like you said, forgotten women who were probably a big part of history.
Absolutely. There's a big movement, a big worldwide movement now to discover lost voices and, the voices of those who have perhaps not been given the chance to speak for themselves. And I'm really proud to be, part of that.
That's amazing. And I know your latest book release, The Crimson Thread, is a retelling of Theseus and the Minotaur in Greek mythology. I know several of your novels, like you mentioned, were retellings, and you do have an amazing talent to make them feel like fresh and new with all the world building and really engaging plot. How do you decide which fairy tales or myths that you want to retell?
It really depends on the story. Sometimes it's the desire to work with a particular myth or fairy tale that leads me to the story. And sometimes I wanted to tell a story set in a certain place and time and then find the story tale that best fits with it. So with the Crimson Thread, which is drawing upon the Minotaur in the Labyrinth myth, I was drawn to tell this story of World War II in Crete, because my great uncle fought there. He was only in his early 20s. He came from Australia and, fought with the Greeks against the Nazis' invasion. It was a terribly, desperate and bitter and bloody battle. It went on for 11 days without respite. And in the end, the Allies lost, and all the Australian, New Zealand and British soldiers had to be evacuated off the island in this incredibly dramatic evacuation that was very much like that of Dunkirk a year earlier. And I was told this story when I was a child, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. And it's kind of lingered in my imagination for a long time. But I needed, ideas have a certain energy about them. And you need more than one idea. You need, I always say, three ideas that seem to click together and have some kind of magnetic energy about them. So for years and years and years, I kept thinking about maybe writing a book about the Battle of Crete and the resistance during the occupation. And then I was reading a book. I bought this incredible first edition copy of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Tanglewood Tales. It's beautiful. It's this big, heavy, leather-bound book. And so it's a retelling of all the Greek myths for children. And as I'm reading through it, I read again the Minotaur in the Labyrinth myth, and I suddenly saw exactly how I could draw upon that myth and retell it in a World War II setting in Crete. And as soon as I had the idea, I was really, really energized and excited by it. So I began to read up on Crete and the war and do a bit of Googling and a bit of reading. And then I discovered the untold story of the women of the resistance in Crete. And, these incredibly brave young women who risked their lives for everything. And at once I knew I had my story. I had my 3 ideas. So, my great uncle's story, the story of the Minotaur, and the story of the brave women of the underground resistance.
Wow. And that's incredible. I did not know Australians fought in the Battle of Crete. That was...
Yes, they did. It was nearly all Australians.
Really?
The Americans had not yet joined the war. So this was in 1941. And it was nearly all Australian and New Zealand soldiers, with a small contingent of British and then Greek civilians. So it was, I think there were 60,000 Anzac soldiers on the island at one point.
Wow, I did not know that. And so did you actually pull a lot of history from into your book, or did you kind of go more off of your great uncle's details from?
No, because I never knew my great uncle. He died before I was born. And he was just a very small cog in the war machine. Mm-hmm. So his war records are quite basic. I did an enormous amount of research. I always do. I love to research, and I think that it's such an important part of creating that deeply immersive reading experience that I'm trying to create for my readers. More than a year of research. I read every single book that was published about the Battle of Crete and about the Nazi occupation of Crete and about the war in general. And then I read every single book I could find about the Minotaur in the Labyrinth myth, of which there are quite a few. And then the way that I research is also deeply immersive. So I was cooking my family Greek food. I was listening to Cretan music, and I was reading Greek poetry, everything from Sappho to Cavalli, right up to modern day. I think it's really, really important that I feel as if I know everything, and that I can inhabit the skin of my characters to make them really come to life.
Well, and I think that is so admirable. And I love that you do that, because a lot of times when I read, I want to feel like I'm transported there, and I love that feeling.
I'm exactly the same, Sarah. I want to be transported. I want to be lifted out of my own life and my own preoccupations and my own body. And I want to live another life for a little while. It's almost like a Zen practice. Where you're out of your own body for a while, and when you come back to it, you're better able to deal with what's going on in your own life. So that's what I seek in my reading experience, and that's what I seek to give in my writing experience.
Oh, fantastic. And when you're writing, how do you approach a retelling? I know you said you did a lot of research. Did you do the research before you even drafted the book?
So I generally do the research before I start writing, because every artist is different. Every writer is different. And so, some like to start straight away and discover the story by writing. I like to imagine the story and see it very vividly in my mind's eye before I start writing. And so I spend quite a long time planning and thinking and daydreaming and, conjuring up my characters and seeking to understand them. And when they are speaking in their own voices, and I know their life histories, then I really feel equipped to write their story. So my process is quite slow to begin with, but once I start writing, I tend to be quite swift in the actual writing. So it's, even a big book like this, the research and the writing takes about the same time.
Did you ever visit Crete? I'm just curious.
Of course I did.
Oh.
I wanted to go there all of my life, ever since I first heard the story of the Battle of Crete from my grandfather. I guess I would have been about 13 or 14. And then I used to read as many books as I could find about Crete growing up. So I've always wanted to go there, always wanted to go to Greece. My husband likes to say that I decide to set a novel somewhere because that's where I want to go next. A tax-deductible trip to Greece, why not? So, yes, my family and I were in Greece for a month. And then I had planned to go back, and then of course COVID hit and we were in lockdown here for almost 2 years, so I wasn't able to get back to Crete, I was so disappointed. I really badly wanted to go back, but I was lucky enough to get some help on the ground. So I had a few Cretan historians who were able to help me, and one even FaceTimed with me and walked me all around the area I was trying to describe, and then he described it and I took notes. So I was looking at the landscape through his phone. It was fantastic.
Yeah. And I love it when authors have visited. Sometimes I feel like I can tell if they visited a place because it just feels like we were talking about, like we're transported there. And especially if I've been there, I can like almost sense where that same place that they're describing. So I was like, I know exactly what they're describing.
I so agree. I think I can tell as well. There's something really visceral about it, something, really, they know how it smells, and they know how the ground feels beneath their feet. And I could never have written this book without going to Crete, because Crete was astonishing. The mountains are so ancient and formidable, and they're completely bare, and they have this incredibly real presence, like you feel as if they are truly alive, and you can understand why the gods were invented in Greece in the way that they were. I live in Sydney, Australia, which means I live right on the ocean, but it's the Pacific Ocean. It's deep, it's dark, it's powerful, and it's dangerous. You don't swim lightly in the Pacific Ocean. You're trained from birth how to catch a wave. The Mediterranean was like swimming in champagne. It's so clear, it's so sparkly, it's so buoyant, it's so clear that you can just float and look down fathoms deep. You can't do that in the Pacific Ocean.
Well, and that's such an accurate description, as swimming in champagne. And I love the imagery there, but it's very true. It is very sparkly and very like kind of shallow there in some places. And it is. And you're absolutely right with the Crete. Crete in itself almost feels, when I heard about your book, I was like, well, Crete itself has got to be like almost feels like you said, a presence in itself, right? Because it's such a big setting. It's such a big place.
Exactly. That was one of my, I'm so glad you've said that, because that was definitely one of my aims in the book, was to have this kind of ancient brooding land as a real presence in the book, almost like a character in itself. And almost, my heroine, whose name is Elenka, she draws great strength from the land. She loves her homeland. She's determined to fight for it. She's determined to free it from oppression, even at the risk of her own life. And the culture of Crete is so extraordinarily beautiful. It's full of laughter and music and poetry and storytelling, and the food is fabulous, and the people are so incredibly welcoming. It's part of their culture that all strangers are friends and must be welcomed and cared for. And I connected so strongly with that, because that's how I like to live my life as well, a life that's full of of music and joy and good food and good wine and good friends, you know. So everywhere that we went in Crete, people recognized our accents because, you know, being Australian, we have quite a distinctive accent. And they would fling open their arms and welcome us. That they would say, "We love you, Australians. You came here. You fought for us. You died for us. Come." And they would give us free food and free, you know, little glasses of that, you know, hideously, fabulously heady alcohol that they drink, which I can't pronounce. Waki, I think everyone calls it. And we were just welcomed with open arms everywhere that we went.
Oh, how lovely. And like you said, Crete in itself is a formidable presence. And so you said, like you mentioned, the gods were kind of came to being there, right? In one way or in another, you know, through mythology. So what drew you exactly to mythology and saying, like, I want to retell that? Because I know you've done fairy tale retellings.
Yeah. So I have worked with myths before as well, in different ways. You know, myths and fairy tales are like the two faces of a coin. Myths tend to be written about men, by men, and fairy tales tend to be told about women, by women. And so because myths are male stories, which what we call androcentric, they are generally more highly regarded than fairy tales, which are women's stories, have heroines at their heart. And so I'm drawn to both. I'm particularly drawn to the very few myths that have a female at the center of it. So, you know, Ariadne and the Labyrinth is one. And even though the story has been mainly told about Theseus, it's not his story. It's Ariadne's story. Ariadne is a Cretan princess. The Minotaur is her half-brother. Her half-brother has been locked in this labyrinth since he was a child and fed only on the blood and flesh of humans. He's been driven mad by his loneliness and the darkness and the human sacrifice made to him. Every 7 years, according to most stories, 7 young men and 7 young women were sacrificed to feed him, which meant that her homeland, the palace of Knossos, was a place of great violence and cruelty. It was Ariadne that decided that things had to come to an end. It was Ariadne who knew the secrets of the labyrinth and who gave Theseus the ball of thread that enabled him to go into the labyrinth and come out safely. He was just her tool, her instrument. It's Ariadne's story, not Theseus's. But of course, he's the one that has been framed as the hero of the story because it's a story that for 4,000 years has been told by men.
And you know what? That makes perfect sense because every time you read them, the Greek myths, it always ends in tragedy for the women. It seems like.
That's right. You know, they are turned into a spectral echo that can only, you know, repeat the words of men. They are turned into trees. They're turned into a gorgon with snakes for hair. You know, they're raped and murdered and treated as slaves and chattels. You know, it's definitely time to reframe the Greek myths from a feminist point of view. And Sarah, I am up to the task.
Perfect. We have Kate Forsyth to help us. I knew it.
Yes, exactly right. So, you know, for me, what fascinated me when I first read the myth when I was only 13 or 14, I always thought of it as being Ariadne's story, not Theseus' story. I wasn't so interested in him. He didn't seem like a very nice person. Well, you know, Ariadne, I think to me, you know, she was a princess. She was really a goddess. The Minoan culture was most probably matriarchal. And if she was not a goddess herself, she was the human embodiment of the goddess. She would have been a high priestess. And that just fascinated me, the real history behind the myth.
Yes, because I thought I was with you. I actually read a little bit about the myth to kind of refresh myself because I knew the bare bones basics of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth, but I was very, like you said, like you were too. I was very interested in Ariadne after the fact because she was put in charge of this labyrinth. It was basically hers, and the Minotaur, like you said, was her half brother. And I was like, well, what happened to her after she helped Theseus? But it followed Theseus, not her. After the
Exactly. And
myth.
it really, really depends on what version of the myth that you read. So in the kind of more modern day retellings, and I'm talking about ones that were done in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, Ariadne escapes with Theseus, and then she either falls sick and dies, or he abandons her and she hangs herself, or he abandons her and then she ends up marrying Dionysus, who's the god of wine and dancing and fun, you know. So in that particular myth, which is the actual oldest version, the god of wine, he takes her crown and he flings it up into the heavens, and it becomes the corona borealis, which is designed to guide people home. It's a key navigational tool in the Mediterranean. And so for me, I love this idea that she lived, she went on, she had love and children and became a goddess, and her crown, helped people find their way home. That's beautiful. I didn't like the stories where she was abandoned and went mad and hanged herself, which is what happens in many versions of this particular myth.
Well, and that sounds like something a man would write, right?
Exactly. She was so devastated to be a man. She was in love and he had his wicked way with her and then abandoned her and she went mad and killed herself. No, not the story I'm going to tell.
Exactly. And I don't think a real woman would really do that anyway. She'd be like, okay, bye. All right. See you later. I like the idea of her going off and finding love elsewhere, like you said.
Exactly. I think it feels more real, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. And, my area of interest in myths and fairy tales, which you did ask me before and I didn't really answer properly, my area of interest in it is really about tracing the stories back to their oldest sources, understanding what true history or what true psychology is buried within them, understanding the role that they had, why they were invented. Stories are not invented only for the purpose of entertainment. They carry meaning. And so I'm always interested in finding that meaning and then bringing the stories back to life for a contemporary audience, finding that those encoded messages of wisdom, myths and fairy tales teach us how to live better. And that's what I'm interested in.
And that's a great way to really retell a fairy tale, taking it back to its roots and kind of uncovering that, like you said, like those real true meanings that were kind of buried and kind of, I think we've lost some of them throughout the time, or they've been transmitted right into different versions.
Exactly. There are always multiple versions of every fairy tale and every myth and every legend and every fable, because anytime anyone retells them, they retell it to suit their worldview and their beliefs about the world and the message that they're trying to express and the audience they're telling it for. And so because the Greek myths are so bloody and violent, when they're retold for children, they often have all that danger and cruelty drained out of them. But in actual fact, they have an important psychological function. We need the darkness in these tales because they teach us that monsters can be defeated. They teach us that we can change the world. It teaches that we can survive tragedy, that we can transform the world. So, I quite like to put the danger and darkness back into them.
And I appreciate that because I do I think it's very, like you said, you can't have lightness without the dark, and so it's really nice to have that dichotomy there, and it's there for a
Yeah.
warning.
Yeah, exactly right. I was talking about this on a radio interview only yesterday, actually. So the Minotaur is a monster.
Mhm.
It's and the word monster comes from the ancient Greek moner, which means to warn. And
Mm.
so other words that come from the same root are things like admonish, to warn someone not to do something,
Mhm.
premonition, to have a forewarning of something that's going to happen, omen, which I think is fantastic, and
Nice.
summon, which means to call someone secretly. So monsters, the word monster comes from the meaning something that warns you of danger, something that tells you how to deal with danger. And so monsters in myth and fairy tale, and indeed in film and any type of narrative, they're there for us to warn us what we might be doing wrong, and
Mm.
also to give us a space to battle with our own demons, with our own inner monsters, the darkness within our psyche. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. It can be used both literally and figuratively, right? Like you mentioned, like kind of you were saying, like as a physical embodiment of,
Exactly.
yes, of those of that darkness, or with the darkness within us too.
And so, for me, in the Crimson Thread, I'm doing a figurative retelling, a
Mm.
metaphorical retelling, rather than a literal retelling. So there is no bull-headed boy in my book. The Minotaur stands in for the cruelty of war, of
Mm.
the fact that young men and young women are sent off to fight at someone else's will to feed their desire for power and their greed to conquer the world. And it's their blood that's being wasted, their all their promise, all the possibilities of their life gone, wasted in someone else's hunger to control the world. That is what the Minotaur is in my book. And of course, that cruelty and that lust for power and that desire to hurt is embodied in several different characters within the story.
Well, and I think that's so fascinating to me too, because I mean, now that you say that, I can make the parallels. Like I'm just like, of course, that sounds just like what war would be, is one of these hungry for greed, these greedy,
Yeah.
thirst for blood type of gods that they want to sacrifice to.
Yeah, exactly right. And the story would always have been metaphorical right from the very, very beginning.
Mhm.
Who was the original Minotaur? Quite possibly it was King Minos, himself, if ever, you know, it, if he ever had that name. But
Mm.
the person about whom the myth grew up about is a metaphor for this kind of, hunger for power and this, desire to cause harm in the world. I mean, Crete didn't ask to be invaded. They had done nothing, nothing to deserve to be, hurt so badly. 90% of their cities and towns and infrastructure was destroyed in the war. They were left in absolute smoking ruins. I actually think it's very, very timely because we're seeing what's happening in the Ukraine right now. We're seeing what happens when a country is invaded without provocation and without cause, and where the people, ordinary people just like you and me, have to seize whatever weapon they can get their hands on and go out and fight for their lives and for their freedom and for their right to, live a peaceful life. This is exactly what happened in Crete. It's very timely.
I was actually thinking that same thing too when you were mentioning the invasion into Crete, and then also too because it's told from a very feminist point of view, given everything that's happened in the U.S. recently of the
Mm.
reproductive rights kind of being rolled back, and then also too with the invasion of Ukraine. So I mean, it is incredibly timely, and what a we'd kind of touched on it earlier. You said it was mythologies are retold or fairy tales are retold given the product of their time. And what a great way to kind of structure this that makes it very current and happening even right now, even though it takes place like several years ago.
Exactly right. That was always in my mind. That was always, one of the things I was trying to do with the book, and for me, the fact that I'm telling a story that's set in World War II, which is still, I think, a great kind of collective psychic wound in our culture. This event that's just at the edges of living memory now. This event where we saw the greatest evil enacted in the world, in our living memory. We are still seeing the harm that has done to each generation that follows. And so I'm taking this story, which is almost within our now, and then I'm drawing on a story which is at least 5,000 years old. And I'm showing that, humans, we are still facing the same dangers, and we still have the same internal struggles. How do you live a good life? How do you enact change in the world? How do you stop war and injustice and cruelty and violence? How do we live better? And so it's the parallel of those two stories. I call it a shadow story. The story of the Minotaur is a shadow story within the story that I'm telling. And so it's you only see it. It's deeply embedded within the structures and symbols of the tale. And that means it's working away in our own subconscious, in our shadow realm of our own mind. And that, I think, gives it a really interesting and unusual depth that perhaps I wouldn't have had if I hadn't been using that shadow story.
But also, too, what a great way to, it's kind of fascinating, but it's kind of sad at the same time that we still have those same problems. I think, like, you recontextualized it for a modern audience, but it is the same struggle we've seen, like you said, 5,000 years ago up to like in the 1940s. And even now we still have the same big questions and how to fix these things.
Except that we know that we can change the world now. So let's say in the time of ancient Greece, women were considered little better than slaves and pigs. And that's a direct quotation from Aristotle. While now, women can vote, can go to university, can be doctors, can be lawyers, they have a huge amount of autonomy over their own lives. We know that those freedoms can be lost. You have seen in your country in the past few weeks how we must always keep on fighting for our rights and freedoms. We can never get complacent. We can never think that the battle has been won. We must always go on working to make the world a better place. And that means women must have their voices. Women must tell their stories. Women must be agents of change in the world. We can't get complacent. And so that is very much at the heart of my novel as well. This idea that we have come so far, but we still have so far to go. And so, it's a clarion call to action as much as it is anything else, because in Greece in 1941, women did not have the vote.
Really?
There was no... women in Greece did not get the vote until 20 years after the end of the war. Now, here in Australia, we were amongst the first countries in the world to grant women the vote, but we didn't give our First Nation people the right to vote until the 60s, which is when I was born. So, in my own country, we have institutional injustice. And in Greece, women, they could go to university, but they weren't granted a degree. They could do all the work and all the study, but they weren't allowed to actually take their degree. And now, of course, they can. So even within that living memory, We've made such enormous strides forward. The rights of gays, for example, how far have we come there? So much further to go. So I'm getting up onto my I can feel myself getting up onto my little soapbox here, and I'm sorry, but I do feel this is one of the purposes of art, is to teach us where we've been, and also to warn us of the dangers that lie ahead, and to equip us to deal with those dangers and overcome them. That is the entire purpose of all art, including myth and fairy tale.
You can get on your soapbox, because I'm with you all the way. It is not that far back that we received these rights, and you're right, we have so much further to go. And this art piece, writing, graphic artists of the world, painters, sculptors, it's a way for them to elevate their medium in order to say something about the world and keep it in the consciousness of the general public, or else, like you're right, it does kind of, we always have to fight, and we always have to kind of present that too in an art piece that can remind people of that.
Yeah, exactly right. Our life is one long journey of learning all the time. We never stop learning. And yet it's far, art, and in particular, I think the narrative arts have such a power to teach us without, I suppose what I'm saying is that they work on two levels. On one level, they entertain and enchant and amuse and transport us. But then they work away in our subconscious at a far deeper level. They change us without us really knowing about it, which is why propaganda works and advertising works so well, because we're so receptive to those sort of things. And someone who stands on a pulpit and preaches, or someone who is very strident and says, you must think this way, we automatically put up our defenses. We automatically guard what we think and feel. But if we're seduced and enchanted and allowed to live someone else's life for a while and understand and empathize with them, we cannot help but want them to triumph. Well, then I think we are better able to understand others, and better able to understand that we can perhaps do work ourselves to pass on the message and change the world. So to me, storytelling is the most effective way to pass on wisdom and new ideas. Like, we need to be able to imagine a better future before we can build it.
That is the most beautiful thing. I think I've heard someone speak of, like, why writing is important, why passing these stories and telling stories is very important. So thank you for that. That was beautiful.
My pleasure. You're welcome to quote me anytime you like.
Yes, absolutely. Because that's a very profound way of putting it, but it's very true. And I actually told my mom I was interviewing you today, and I was mentioning, well, she puts real history into her stories. And I told her about the Battle of Crete, and she didn't know much about it, but she says, she doesn't read often, but she wants to read things that have historical significance, so she can really learn more about that if she can, because she says there's so much I don't know about the world. And I look to authors.
It's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that humans are naturally hungry to learn and to understand. And that I think that, if we understand, if we search out knowledge, if we're constantly reading and watching and listening and discovering new things, we keep our brain alive. And, we're constantly setting up new neural networks in our brain. And it makes our brain so much mightier, so much more powerful, and so much likely to serve us well for all of our lives.
Something I was curious about too, since you mentioned the mind, and you're right, we are constantly learning things. Did you use the labyrinth as a symbolism? I've heard that before. Labyrinths can be symbolism of the mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, for me, the labyrinth is a symbol of our unconscious mind.
Okay.
And when we walk the labyrinth, we're walking into the deepest, most secret part of ourselves, and we're facing our own shadow self. The monsters of our own psyche. But it's not all. It's not all the bad things that are kind of repressed in our psyche. It's all the things that we have forgotten, or that we've been too afraid to know about ourselves, or that we've been told. So for example, I find a lot of women feel that they have no right to tell their own story because all of their lives have been told to be good, to be quiet, to put others first, to serve others, and to keep themselves in the background. And so their own natural voice is in there, repressed, unable to speak. It's been made mute. And so when we walk the labyrinth and we walk down into that deep and secret part of ourselves, and we face our own shadow self, we can find enormous creative energies in that. And we can find anger, and we can find beauty, and we can find our true selves by embracing that part of ourselves. And then we walk back out of the labyrinth, back into the shining upper air, and we are more whole than we were before. We have learnt something on that journey, and the journey always has to be difficult, because only things that are difficult are worthwhile. And so it's not an easy journey within, but it's absolutely crucial to us in our growth towards being our best possible selves.
And that's actually one of the things I heard a lot growing up. It's actually one of my favorite sayings right now is it's kind of something you mentioned, was anything worth having doesn't come easy. So, and that was something I was told all my life. And that it is, you're right. It's like a journey of self-discovery of some sort, kind of traversing through our own subconscious and learning that we do have all these, anger or joy and happiness. We have the capacity for all these emotions, and how we can harness that and learn more about that. I love that kind of imagery you kind of built with that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think it's what drew me to the Minotaur in the Labyrinth story to begin with, was that I intuitively knew that the labyrinth had this very powerful symbolic meaning, and a big part of the challenges and difficulties of writing this book was to show that without saying it.
Okay.
So when you read The Crimson Thread, the reader is really taken on a journey into the dark heart and then back out into the light again. And but at no point do I say, reader, this is what you are experiencing now. They simply have to inhabit the story, inhabit the skin of my characters, and undertake that journey of discovery themselves.
And kind of, we said in the beginning, that's kind of that's the fun part of it. That's the immersive part as a reader, where we want to be in that, and we'll get to go on that journey with the protagonist.
I think, from the point of view of the writing of the book, which the whole point is that you want to hook your reader in, engage them, make them feel as if they are there. And then once they are like inhabiting the story, it begins to preoccupy their waking hours, and it creeps into their dreams, and it becomes so real. And then you can take them anywhere. I feel they will follow you on your journey because they are so deeply invested into the place and the time and the characters that you have created. And so that's what I'm always seeking to do. And it's never easy. And it's like what we said before about how the difficulty is part of the point. That's how I feel about writing, is that if it was easy, it wouldn't be so worthwhile. The struggle of me, the writer, to try and make the words do what I want them to do, it's not easy, but that challenge makes it so worthwhile. And the time, I can't tell you how many times I rewrote this book, dozens of times, to try and get every single word, the exact right word in the exact right place, and doing and creating the feeling that I wanted it to, because it's all about feeling.
Well, lovely. I can't wait to read it. I've already put in my pre-order, so I'm excited to read it.
Thank you.
So, and you've told us so much about this amazing book. So where can listeners find your book?
So in the US, my book is published by Blackstone and should be available in all good bookstores, and is also available as an ebook and an audio book. And so that's the kind of northern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere, the book is published by Penguin, and again is available online, ebooks, audiobooks, in all formats. So you should have no trouble getting your hands on it or your ears on it.
Oh, perfect. Even better, because I love listening to audiobooks while I'm like doing housework. So definitely going to grab the audiobook version too. And how can readers connect with you?
Again, I'm very easy to connect with because, to me, social media is simply a way to have fabulous, interesting conversations with interesting people all around the world. So I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I have a blog and a website. I have a new website that was meant to be up this week, but should hopefully be up next week, and with lots of resources. I also do a lot of book club, virtual events. So if you're in a book club and you think that you might want to read my book, if we can try and make the time difference work, I'm happy to come along and chat to you and answer your questions via the miracle of the internet.
Perfect. Yeah. And I think everybody's well acquainted with Zoom now, so it should be pretty easy. So thanks so much to Kate for being part of the podcast. All the links for today's guest will be included in the show notes. If you enjoy the content and find it valuable, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a review. It helps grow the podcast and boost episodes for others to find the content. I'm so thrilled for your support and everyone who continues to listen. Really, I'm just having fun absorbing all the knowledge from these incredible guests and hear their insight on lessons learned. I don't know about you, but it encourages me to finish my own novel. Book recommendation for this episode, The Crimson Thread by Kate Forsyth. As always, be safe, stay well, and keep writing. Bye!